Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar. I'm Alan Rennick, Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'm your chair for the seminar today, in which we're talking about votes at 16. So the Labour government has committed to lowering the voting age for Westminster elections from 18 to 16. So there are lots of questions to ask. What might the consequences of this change be? Perhaps most importantly, what practical steps will be required to implement the change and to ensure that it works effectively, that it works well? How, for example, might teaching about politics in schools need to change? And what can we learn from Scotland, Wales, and other places where 16 and 17-year-olds are already able to vote? To explore these matters, we're joined today by a fantastic panel. Dr. Christina Huebner is lecturer in Quantitative Social Sciences at the University of Sheffield and has conducted extensive research into votes at 16. Marcus Flucker is the member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Angus South and therefore has direct experience of the working of a lower franchise age. And Liz Moorse is CEO of the Association for Citizenship Teaching, which recently submitted evidence to the ongoing English curriculum review on ways in which the teaching of citizenship in schools might be strengthened. Our plan for today is that each of the speakers will make opening remarks, after which we'll have some discussion on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. Questions will be gathered today by Tom Fleming, whom you can also see on your screen. So if you've got a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function here on Zoom. Tom will then select a broad range of those questions and read them out. And if you'd like to ask your question anonymously, you can indicate that when you submit your question. Let me also just note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. And you might want to take that into account when deciding whether to ask your question anonymously. So that's enough by way of introduction from me, and I will hand straight over to our first speaker, and that will be Christina Huebner.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks everyone for joining. This lowering of the voting age comes at a time where we're actually in quite a fortunate position, because unlike 1969, when the UK was the first country to lower the voting age back then from 21 to 18, now there are countries who've done this before, not the least the two nations, Scotland and Wales. And that means there is empirical evidence on really what happens when the voting age is lowered from 18 to 16, and what is important when lowering the voting age to include 16 and 17-year-olds in the franchise. So we actually don't just need to think about this theoretically, we can actually look at empirical evidence from other places, obviously with caveats of how well they apply to the circumstances in the UK. And I've brought a little bit from that evidence. Mostly we have dug into this empirically. We've done evaluations, surveys with young people, with educators, with electoral officers. We followed the process in Austria very closely, from where we have good data. Germany and Belgium have lowered the voting age for some elections, where we also have a very good empirical evidence. Estonia, Malta, and not the least Scotland and Wales. And when all of the research is taken together, we have a little group and we meet online internationally and bring all the evidence. We've dug and dug and dug for negative things, catastrophic outcomes, and so far we haven't really found very much. So probably the main takeaway is when the voting age gets lowered from 18 to 16, probably nothing catastrophic will happen as far as the evidence goes. We have found no evidence of any inculcation from parents or teachers. For example, in the Scottish independence referendum, the first time that 16 and 17-year-olds were allowed to take part in an election in Britain in 2014, only about 57% of young people chose the same vote option as their parents, which means that 1 in 4 chose something different from their parents. So there's not really a lot of evidence for any kind of following parental patterns. Research also shows that young people are able to select who they vote for in the same way and to the same sort of quality standards as other voters, meaning that they can articulate their preferences and then choose a political party along the same lines, roughly in the same way as older people would, and to the same standard of decision making. Their political attitudes are heterogeneous, as much as, if not more so than that of the general population. And also, quite frankly, there's too few of them to really shift the dial in elections. We've done some modelling. What would have happened in previous elections had 16 and 17-year-olds been allowed to vote in different constituencies, and really very, very little would change. There's one concern around inequality and who turns out to vote, and I'll come back to that in a second. So that's something that we can discuss. But all in all, we've seen very few catastrophic or negative outcomes from countries that have gone through this process so far. And that's really different from 1969, when Britain was the front runner to lower the voting age. And by all accounts, there wasn't a lot of policy learning. So it was seen as a bit of an opportunistic move to bring younger voters in line with the current government. Didn't work out so well. So really, we have an opportunity here to rely on evidence and look at what kind of outcomes might be achieved. And there is an opportunity to really use the lowering of the voting age as a mechanism to embed younger people into the electorate and strengthen their identities as democratic citizens under certain circumstances. And this is probably where it gets most interesting. That's the question of really what is important when we implement this policy. So there are indications that 16 and 17-year-olds vote more often than, for example, young people who experience their first election at 18. That's kind of plausible if you think about that 18 is a quite unstable period. Marcus, maybe you can talk a little bit about that later. You know, when you're moving out of the parental home, you're going to university, especially in a country where voter registration is required. That is makes voting just another chore for young people. And that doesn't mean that it's not a barrier that many young people manage to overcome, but it is just that little bit harder. At 16, 17, most young people are still in secondary education. They're a bit more stable sort of patterns in their lives. So it could be a better way. And we have evidence that that seems to be the case consistently from Austria, Latin America, Germany, Scotland, and there's also evidence on this from Wales. Now, this doesn't mean that it's sort of an effect that will last forever. At some point, every 16-year-old will have had the chance to be eligible to vote. So at some point, the higher turnout that we're currently observing among these younger age groups will wear off. We don't really know yet how long that's going to last, and that's probably very much dependent on the circumstances in which the voting age was lowered. It's quite plausible that in Scotland, the way that the independence referendum set the context for the lowering of the voting age mobilized young people to really have a serious voice in the direction that the country was taking, makes some of these effects that we see for Scotland quite relevant. There is evidence as well that young people who vote earlier feel taken more seriously. That's usually what we find in qualitative studies. They feel as engaged democratic citizens, and that could lead, my colleague Constanza Sanueza-Petrarca has found this in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador have lowered the voting age more than 10, 15 years ago now, that these young people show increased trust in democratic institutions compared to older age group. That is something we haven't been able to replicate everywhere. In some countries in Western Europe, obviously, trust in institutions is already at a very high level, but there is room for that, it seems, in some context. Taken together, nothing catastrophic is going to happen. If positive things happen in terms of embedding young people into electorate, instilling trust in institutions, probably very much so depends on the circumstances of the implementation of a lower voting age. And this is where things like civic education are really interesting. How confident are young people to participate in elections and to make a choice? We find that the consistency of the implementation is really important. So that means that it's valuable to not treat this as a piecemeal approach, lowering the voting age only for certain elections, but not all elections. I've spoken to a lot of young people in Scotland who were pretty dismayed about the fact that they were allowed to vote from 16 in the 2016 Scottish Parliament elections that took place in May, but not in the UK's EU referendum that took place only 4 weeks later. That's an inconsistency that's quite difficult to sell to young people, and it would be worthwhile therefore to take a comprehensive and consistent approach. Consistency across good quality democratic education for young people is equally important. And this is where I want to come back to that small niggling piece of negative evidence. We are, as researchers, concerned that not everyone turns out to vote. That is true for the whole population, but it is also true for young people. And if we have a lower voting age and not got consistent and high quality democratic education, we effectively rely on young people's social circles, their families, their peers to mobilize them to vote. And that's possibly a game that will just sustain inequality in who registered to vote and who turns out to vote. It's something we've seen quite prevalent in Wales when the voting age was lowered in 2021. We now know that Wales is taking a consistent approach to democratic education, so this might change, but it is a concern that we are entrenching political inequality in terms of who turns out to vote and has the capabilities to do that. So full inclusion for young people is important through consistency. It's also important in terms of what other actors do. So this is not so much the onus on young people to take up the opportunity to vote, but there are also requirements and responsibilities for political parties to seriously engage with younger voters and with the media to show that younger voters are part of the electorate. In Scotland, for example, there are some really interesting examples from 2014 and 15 when the BBC Scotland made up a panel of audience members for the last TV debate before the referendum, only out of 16 and 17-year-olds, which shows that young people are taken seriously and a part of the electorate. So all in all, we think that the implementation is really important. We have some evidence on what is important in that implementation, and it's probably not just one thing. So we really need to look at this as a sort of an approach in multiple dimensions, whether that's civic education, voter registration, even if you think about voter ID, and it probably requires action from multiple government departments to work together. Probably nothing bad will happen if that doesn't happen, but there is a real opportunity here to do some good heavy lifting to embed young people into the electorate.
Fantastic, Christina. So much rich evidence there. That was really helpful. Great. Let us move on next to Marcus, who has experienced votes at 16 on the ground. So Marcus, what would you like to share?
Thanks, Alan, and good afternoon, everyone. So when I turned 16, I got to do something which is somewhat unique for teenagers in the world. I got to vote. And there are just a handful of countries where 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. And I'm immensely proud that Scotland is one of them. The Scottish Youth Parliament has long championed votes at 16. In 2012, made it our national campaign, advocating for the right for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in the 2014 referendum. In the lead up to the referendum, SYP led an information campaign on registering 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, which was called I, Not, Maybe. We also delivered information sessions, and they were on the importance of political literacy and registering to vote. The success of that campaign led the way for their inclusion in every Scottish Parliament and local election since 2016. And as we already know, Wales followed Scotland's example in 2021. And it's really exciting to be speaking about this across the UK today. So when preparing to cast my first vote, I spent many an evening watching the leaders' debates, reading news articles, speaking to my friends, parents and teachers about the election. So when I walked into that polling booth, I knew exactly what to do and was 100% confident in the votes that I cast. Living through a global pandemic and having a chance to study history and modern studies sparked my interest for politics, to the point of near complete distraction and anticipation for the 2021 Scottish Parliament election. Modern studies is actually a subject unique to Scotland. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, the best way I can describe it is that it's the perfect mix of politics and sociology. Now, as an entirely self-confessed politics nerd, I practically skipped to the polling station that morning before school, but I'm under no illusion that most of my peers did not prepare to the extent to which I did. But nor should they have had to, because all of this information should have been readily available to them. Later in 2021, I was elected as a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for the first time, and I began representing my home constituency of Angus South. The following May, I led events at my school to encourage others to vote in the local elections, and I was struck by how many young people that I represent who felt nervous about voting. Some worried they might make a mistake, most didn't know where their polling station was or how to find it, and some were hesitant because they didn't want their parents to know how they had voted. But a recurring theme of these discussions was that modern studies had explained to young people how Scotland's political system worked, but not how they can participate in it. Research by Jan Ektorn and our very own Christina Huebner shows that, which was mentioned earlier, shows that votes at 16 in Scotland has been a real success. And as we already heard, their findings indicate that turnout is higher amongst those who vote for the first time at 16 or 17, and this early engagement can foster a habit of voting, contributing to sustained political participation throughout one's life. They also found that lowering voting age can enhance the effectiveness of civic education. When young people are granted the right to vote, there's a great impetus to provide them with comprehensive political education, hopefully leading to a more informed and engaged electorate. And as I learned myself, this second point is crucial. If we want young people to vote at 16 and to keep voting, we need to equip them with the tools to do so confidently. Schools, youth workers, and civic society must collaborate to teach practical skills like how to register to vote, how to decipher a manifesto, and how to think critically about media content, especially now with the increasing threat of AI-driven misinformation. And all of this needs to be properly resourced. Scotland's approach to citizenship education has been described as a golden thread, which is woven through the curriculum. However, during my secondary education, I can struggle to remember receiving any citizenship education outside of studying for my politics and modern studies exams. Based on my own experience, I feel integrating these lessons into the existing curriculum can only work if teachers and youth workers are adequately supported and empowered. But Votes at 16 isn't just a political reform. It's about fulfilling young people's rights as outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Research by YouGov even suggests that there is greater support amongst the public for the right to vote at 16, rather than for reducing the voting age from 18 to 16, despite these being exactly the same thing. So what does this tell us? It tells us we must not separate votes at 16 from young people's right to be heard. The UNCRC is the basis for the Scottish Youth Parliament's mission and values. And so during my time as an MSYP, I've gained a much greater understanding of what my rights are. My recommendation here is that the UNCRC is not merely an argument in support of votes at 16. It is the very basis of it. So in moving forward with the implementation of votes at 16, we must ensure that we teach young people about all their rights, not just their right to vote. We can now be more certain than ever before that the right to vote at 16 and 17 will become a reality soon for every young person in the UK. But manifesto commitments don't make change, legislation does. I recently attended a conference in Belfast where young people and youth workers were organising to help push forward the Vote 16 campaign in Northern Ireland. Votes at 16 actually gained cross-party support and the backing of the Stormont Assembly well over a decade ago. But yet, young people in Northern Ireland are still waiting for their right to vote. The lesson I learned from my short time in Belfast is that this campaign only really ends when the law changes. The breakneck pace of politics at Westminster means that we have a responsibility to keep the pressure on the UK government so that they fully deliver this commitment. So to conclude, my lessons for making Votes at 16 a success are this. First, we need to do more than just educate young people about our political system. We need to empower them with practical skills so they can actively participate in democracy. And this might involve us rethinking how we deliver citizenship education. Second, Votes at 16 is not separate from young people's rights. Both are intrinsically linked. And lastly, we must remember that this campaign isn't quite over just yet. So let's keep talking about Votes at 16, let's keep hearing the voices of our young people, and let's ensure that every young person in the UK can enjoy their right to vote someday soon. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marcus. Again, so many interesting things for us to pick up. We're going to have a rich conversation further on in this this seminar. Thank you so much. But before we get there, Liz Moorse talking about citizenship education. Liz, over to you.
Great, thanks, Alan. Thanks, everybody, and good afternoon to everybody. It's wonderful to be part of this panel discussion today. So I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking through what citizenship education is and its role in our curriculum and how it can be strengthened so that every young person gets their entitlement to high quality teaching about democracy, politics, the rule of law, human rights, identities and communities, how the media works, and active citizenship skills. And it's those sorts of concepts and ideas that form the basis of a really good high quality citizenship education. I should just say up front though that we have a devolved education system in the UK, and so citizenship education takes slightly different forms in the different parts of the UK. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the situation in England, partly because that's the one that we support in the main, although we do work with colleagues in schools and teachers across the other parts of the United Kingdom as well. And we're at an interesting juncture here in England because currently the government is looking again at our national curriculum, what should be taught, when, and what that should comprise of for different students at different age groups in our school system. So this is a great time to be thinking about these big questions about what education is for, why every child has a right to good quality citizenship and democracy education, and how we can make that even better than it is currently. So citizenship education in England was introduced in the year 2000. It followed a very important report led by Professor Sir Bernard Crick, and was accepted in full by the then Secretary of State for Education, David Blunkett. And since that time, schools in England, in theory at least, have been implementing citizenship education as a national curriculum subject. It's also a GCSE qualification, and so it's something that at the age of 14 to 16, some students get the opportunity to study in greater depth, and for some students again that might lead on to further study in subjects like politics or sociology. I think what's really important about citizenship is that it covers not just the facts, not just the information we need about how politics works in this country, but it's infused with big concepts and ideas that require critical thinking, looking at evidence, weighing things up, making informed choices, being part of deliberation and debate, and getting that active experience of democracy. And active citizenship or active participation in democracy is something that we see as a fundamental part of good citizenship education. It brings the subject to life. It helps the subject be issues driven rather than just a sort of dry and dusty civics course, which sometimes these things are in danger of. I also think we can look a bit bigger picture here today, because we can think about schools in a way as microcosms of society. They're places where young people can test out theories and ideas and have real practical experiences of decision making, collaboration, taking part in different kinds of action with their peers. And that's really important, that there is that space, that safe space, if you like, for young people to have those experiences. It's part of what we call the civic mission of schools. And I think we see citizenship as so important, it should be seen as important as maths or literacy or those sorts of subjects as well. I think we're all too aware of the challenges facing society and actually the whole world at the moment. Marcus mentioned the problems of dis and malinformation earlier, and those are very real and serious, and they become even more apparent during elections. And actually that's something we all need to be concerned about for every citizen. And how are we going to build not just the political literacy that every young person and actually every adult needs, but the media and information literacy that they also need. So we need to think in the round about this, and we need to think about these things urgently and seriously if we're going to make a real attempt to counter some of these negative effects in society and the bad actors that we sometimes see. So I think we're at a really interesting moment in our journey of citizenship education. I think there's lots of opportunities to improve what we're doing. One of the key things that we at the Association for Citizenship Teaching is calling on, as well as a strengthening of the subject in our national curriculum, is that we need more trained and specialist citizenship teachers. Citizenship teachers are really important because they handle a whole range of sensitive, controversial and complex issues, and they need to be skilled up with the pedagogies and practices that can counter the conspiracy theories, the misinformation and the bad actors that we see at play in society. And unless this government invests heavily in more citizenship teachers, we're never going to get to a point where there is a trained specialist teacher for every school, and that should be the absolute minimum requirement. So I'm going to stop there and hope that we can go into a bit more discussion and pick up some other points as we go through and answer questions.
Fantastic, Liz. Again, really interesting. Thank you so much. I feel quite inspired by some of what you were saying there. So that's really great. We will move to audience questions in just a little bit. I can see we've already had some come in, so many thanks for those. And if you'd like to ask a question, now is your time to get those questions in while we have a little bit of a panel discussion first before we get to audience questions. So Liz, can I maybe just stick with you a little bit further, actually? I mean, you set out there really clearly some what seemed to me very, very sensible ideas about what the citizenship curriculum ought to look like. What's your sense of the degree of political support for those kinds of ideas and the degree to which this might actually happen? And I guess part of that question is the degree to which the current government, UK-wide government, might be interested in picking up on these ideas, but also it's a kind of longer term concern about the long-term sustainability of citizenship education. And I guess there's often a concern on the right of politics that, bluntly, teachers tend to be on the left, and therefore citizenship teaching means people being taught in a way that might kind of skew their political perceptions. And we heard from Christina evidence that it's not obvious that that has been the case in countries that do have votes at 16. But how can, so firstly, what's the current government likely to do? And then secondly, how can we get kind of broader consensus across the political spectrum around the support for citizenship education that you've talked about?
Yeah, great questions. Thanks, Alan. So first of all, in terms of cross-party political support for this subject, I mean, to be honest, education has become a real political hot potato in this country. And when I talk to colleagues who work in other parts of Europe or the wider world, they're actually quite shocked and surprised how political our education policy and system is. You know, the fact that at the stroke of a pen, a minister can change what is taught in schools is worrying, you know, and we don't have that independent curriculum body or agency that takes a kind of broad sweeping look at what education needs. And I think that, to be honest, is a bit of a problem in the UK. When citizenship was introduced in England, there was cross-party political support. And the person that I mentioned earlier, Professor Sir Bernard Crick, was particularly adept at making sure that there was cross-party political support. Of course, not everybody agrees with everything in education, and there can be quite strong and polarizing views on this. But I think the vast majority of people see that if we want to protect and safeguard our democracy, if we still believe that is the best form of government, then we need to just treat it as another standard part of mainstream education that everybody should be entitled to. In terms of the long-term sustainability of the subject, that's a really important question. And I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, I think the earlier that citizenship education starts, the better. So we are calling for it to be statutory in primary schools as well as secondary. One of the interesting things about citizenship is that it's called citizenship. a word that can mean different things to different people. It wasn't called political education or politics. And that was partly in reflection of the fact that we need to take care, particularly with young children, and there is a law in place around this, to make sure they are not politically indoctrinated by lefty teachers or righty teachers or any other partisan viewpoints. And of course, teachers are bound by laws themselves, which means they need to treat political matters impartially. Impartially doesn't mean neutrally, it means making sure a range of viewpoints is presented fairly and accurately when they're teaching contentious political issues in particular. But there is absolutely no harm in young children learning about how politics works, what a political party does, how voting works, and they can do this in very practical ways. Marcus mentioned his interest and involvement in student councils and youth voice, and that can be a very powerful and real way of engaging very young children in simple decision-making processes that help them get a handle on some of this. So I think in combination there, we desperately need to see this as an automatic right, an entitlement as part of a broad and balanced education. We need a long-term sustainable plan that starts with the youngest in society and continues on to those who become voters, hopefully perhaps at 16 in the future. We need to ensure that teachers are fully trained and understand and can handle the contrary and contrasting issues and controversies that they will no doubt come across in impartial ways, and that's something that we specialise and train teachers in. And my final point is going back to teacher training. I can't stress enough the importance of specialist trained citizenship teachers, and only when we get a teacher in every school will we really have that embedded sustainability to go forward from.
And that training is partly about overcoming those concerns about bias, and because it can be really hard sometimes for people to teach in a way that doesn't allow their own perspectives to come through, but with good training that it's much easier.
Knowing when to disclose, when it's appropriate to do, and it must be for an educational reason. It's not very different really to sort of thinking about the teaching of religious education or religious studies. You may have your own personal religious set of beliefs and values that you believe in, but your role is to teach religion and religious perspectives and worldviews in the round. And that's your role and your duty as a good teacher. And I think history teachers are probably in a similar category as well.
And do you have much sense of how ambitious the current government is? That there was a Commons written question with an answer just a couple of weeks ago that made me, I guess, a bit concerned that there didn't seem to be terribly much ambition from the government in terms of developing citizenship education further. What's your sense?
I'm not sure about that, Alan. I think the government is struggling with some very difficult budgetary restraints and constraints, and they've got a lot of different competing priorities, as any government has. And although they've embarked on a very serious and wide-ranging set of educational reforms, including what the national curriculum looks like in the future, what assessment looks like, what our qualification system looks like in the future. There is a finite amount of money to make those changes, and any change in our education system has a sort of dominoes effect. It affects how teachers are prepared and trained, it affects what current schools are doing, it will affect the textbooks, materials and resources that they're using. So there are a whole train of cost implications when you make changes, and I suspect somebody is very mindful of that. There's been a number of debates recently, both in the Lords and in the Houses of Commons, about the role of citizenship education. There were 28 Lords that spoke in a debate earlier in the autumn term last year, and a Westminster Hall debate at which another 20 or so politicians in the Commons spoke on behalf of schools doing citizenship education. So there is plenty of support in both houses for this, and constant meetings going on, as you might expect, behind the scenes. Sometimes there is more activity than perhaps we can talk about publicly. Meetings with the Secretary of State, meetings with departmental officials and the people involved in the current independent panel review that is looking at the curriculum. The government have committed to a national curriculum that's truly national. So once this new curriculum is reformed, every school will have to do it. It doesn't matter whether you're an academy, a free school, or a comprehensive locally maintained school, you will be required to follow the national curriculum. And I think that's a very good thing. I think I'm a great fan of giving schools choices and freedoms, but I also think we need a very clear statement of what is so important, that every child in our country should learn about it, and citizenship is certainly up there.
Good to hear. Thank you. If any of you want to comment on anything that any of the others have, either of the others has said, do please feel free. But Marcus, going to you perhaps next. It's been interesting to hear from Liz talking about the content of citizenship education there. And I wonder, just from your perspective, what is important and what needs to be in place in citizenship education? You talked a little bit about the content of what people need to know, and that you talked about how people knew how the system worked, but not how they could actually take part, just the immediate practicalities of the voting process. And you also talked about not just kind of the formal curriculum, but also the work of the Scottish Youth Parliament and other kind of, as Liz was talking about, active participation processes that help people take part in politics. So what matters from your point of view here?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I think, in answering that, there, I kind of go back to that, line from my opening remarks about the young people that I spoke to, which, was my school, was my area, a part of Scotland. But, from SYP, I'm quite confident that those kind of sentiments are in the round reflected across Scotland. They said that it's great that we learn, the difference between a reserved issue and a devolved issue. It's great that we learn that MSP, the acronym, stands for Member of Scottish Parliament. It's great that we learn there's 129 members, but I don't really know what my role is in actively engaging with them. And I think that is kind of what it is that people want real skills, that they want to be talked through what actually happens when you walk into a polling station. What does the ballot look like? What do you do with it? In Scotland, we've got the unique challenge of 3 different voting systems at play. So we use first past the post for Westminster elections like everybody else, but we also got what's known as the additional member system or mixed member proportional for Scottish Parliament elections, and then single transferable vote for our local elections. So, we quite often, I've worked a few polling nights, and quite often you see people making mistakes on their ballot because they've used the wrong system. People putting numbers rather than crosses. These are the real skills that people want to know because they want their vote to matter. They want to know that they've been able to engage. I think the dimension that changes here recently is that point about misinformation, disinformation, and the kind of the world we're living in. I heard Emily Maitlis talk about this recently. The kind of reality that we're always living in a post-truth world where people can say whatever they want, even if it's untrue, particularly if they're posting it on certain social media platforms, which is crazy to think about. So I think another thing that people really said to me was, who should I really trust? What information should I really try to find? And I think that that's a big thing, is people being able to get those skills of, it doesn't mean that we think that every young person should read The Guardian or The Telegraph or The Daily Mail, but it means that we're able to give young people the skills to be able to think about that for themselves and work out what media content align with their own values, what political parties align with their own wants and needs. I think that it's similar to what Liz was talking about. You don't, in citizenship education, you don't need to necessarily be apolitical, you just need to be politically impartial. It's something that, one of our values at Scottish Youth Parliament is political impartiality. It's not difficult. There seems to be some in the media and online who suggest that we should be teaching these things because teachers can't be impartial. I personally think that's sensationalism. My experience is that all of my teachers were impartial in teaching me about what our political system looks like. And actually, we need to come to teachers' defence a little bit in that realm. We need to make sure that we're giving them a little bit of backing, because they're actually trying to do a very difficult task, which is distill a really broad description of the political system into something that's digestible in 50-minute periods. I think the other thing as well, which I kind of want to talk about, is the role of non-formal education, things like youth work or youth voice networks. These can be, I think particularly youth workers have a great role in engaging young people, and particularly those who, a lot of people would describe them as harder to reach. So I'm not a massive fan of that phrase, but it's universally understood, I think. I think that they play a great role in engaging young people who are maybe not being engaged in the classroom, because they deserve their right to vote as well. At Scottish Youth Parliament, we make a great effort to reach those seldom heard voices, whether that's young people who are out of education, involved in the justice system, have a disability, whatever their situation is. We make sure that we try to engage in different formats. Sitting in a classroom, listening to a PowerPoint from a teacher and then doing a worksheet isn't the right format for every young person. Things can be more engaging than that. For some young people, it might look like what I did, which is get involved in my youth voice structure, first my pupil council and then Scottish Youth Parliament. But that doesn't need to be the route for every young person. And so I think we need to think about this holistically as well. So that would be my answer there, Alan.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was exactly going to go into that territory of thinking about things other than citizenship, formal curriculum, because I agree that that's very important. And Christina, turning to you, so feel free to pick up anything that's been said so far, but I was exactly going to ask you about what other things should we be talking about here. We've focused quite a lot about citizenship education, but what are the other things where there's evidence that they make a difference to the nature of the impact of votes at 16?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And first of all, I can only aggressively agree with what Marcus and Liz have said. I think they hit the main points that we also see repeated in research, that students want to learn how to make up their own minds, that they need classroom debate, that safe space to build political opinions. That's probably more important than educating policy nerds. Outside of school, and I'm a big fan of not putting every responsibility on teachers and schools, because I think there's a limit to what they can do. Really, non-formal education, youth work is incredibly important on the one side, and is also particularly important. We've seen that this work is systematically funded. So in Wales, we've done a lot of heavy lifting with youth work organisations in mobilising young people, particularly peer-to-peer mobilisation ahead of the 2021 election. And there are some really good sort of small-scale examples that need to be rolled out. And I think systematic funding for these kinds of organisations to do the work that they already know how to do is really important. Wales is a really interesting space to take a good look at. I know that colleagues from Wales are on the call, because there is a lot of really good things happening in that space, where youth work organisations, members of the civil service in Wales and the Electoral Commission, they meet regularly and discuss mobilisation approaches, non-formal education approaches, what is being done to mobilise young people ahead of elections. And I think that's a really nice systematic approach for organisations to pool resources, to work together, and to work together with the actors that they can also receive support from. So non-formal education, big plus there, is really important. I wanted to add one thing on the issue of teachers' lack of confidence in teaching sort of political opinions, controversial issues. I am with Marcus on this, that this is probably a topic that is slightly unhelpfully sensationalized in this country. I've worked with colleagues in Estonia, where admittedly the challenge of political influence is probably a bit bigger than here, given that it's got a big Russian minority, Russian-speaking minority. So there are lots of problems. When Estonia lowered the voting age, they've implemented something really interesting, where a council consisting of pupil representatives, democratic educationalists, and from all of the minorities come together regularly and determine what are the guidelines for what should and shouldn't be taught in schools. So I'm not saying that this solves all problems, but there are ways out of this problem of sensationalizing and worrying about the inculcation of young people in schools in sort of practical ways. I'm jumping a bit back to what's happening outside of schools. One of the things that I always want to stress is that the onus is not on young people to turn out to vote. The onus is also on us giving young people the opportunities to engage seriously with political issues. I see a big lack there from political parties. We've seen that in Wales, to a lesser extent in Scotland, because of the very unique circumstances of the referendum. But really, young people need also to have options to vote for. And things that are worth voting for, and the onus here is on political parties to provide those options and to provide the remaining information as well. Marcus mentioned that knowing what kind of information is out there to make up your mind to make a confident choice and who to vote for is really important, and is the number one reason that young people do not vote is when they lack the confidence to make up their minds. So trustworthy information is really important. Again, it's really interesting to look at Wales, where there are advances to build a database of manifestos that are sort of spread and hosted on a trustworthy source under the auspices of the Welsh Government. That could be a way. In Germany, for example, there's really good experience with vote advice applications that are maintained and redacted by the Civic Education Authority. So there's a very trustworthy source, and lots of young people use these to make up their minds and who to vote for. So there are, again, practical approaches and things that can be done to provide that sort of trustworthy source of information. But the main point is coming down to giving young people options and easy ways to reach that information.
I feel obliged to mention the Constitution Unit's Doing Democracy Better report, published in about 2018 or 2019, I think, which looked at some of these international examples of how to improve the quality of information available in election and referendum campaigns, and we explored exactly some of those examples. So yeah, and you also talked in your initial comments, Christina, about the role of the media in ensuring that young people are included in the discourse, and it isn't just a conversation among more traditional older voters. Great, thank you so much. We've had quite a few questions in so far. If you're still thinking, oh, there's something I'd like to ask here, then please do continue to add questions into the Q&A on Zoom. But I'm going to ask Tom to reappear onto our screen so that we can start exploring what questions we have had so far. So we'll take questions normally in groups of 3. So Tom, what do you have for us in a first round?
Okay, thanks, Alan. So this first group of 3 questions are all related to how the things people have been discussing and votes at 16 relate to kind of wider political reforms. The first is from an anonymous attendee who asks, what implications are there for voter ID? And are any of the panel able to comment on whether something would have to be done to boost ID ownership among 16-year-olds? We then have Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy, who says giving 16-year-olds the right to vote, which they support, and better political education would be significant progress, but they also need to be on the electoral register to be able to exercise the right to vote. So shouldn't the campaign for votes at 16 go hand in hand with the campaign for automatic voter registration? And then another anonymous attendee asks whether these various proposals about providing more information to young voters are specific to young voters or actually are about challenges facing voters in general.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. So you're welcome to pick up any question of those questions that you feel that you have something to say on. So Christina, will I go to you first?
Yeah, I can probably say a little bit to all of these, but I'm very keen to see what Marcus and Liz say. Voter ID and voter registration are 2 big barriers. Probably voter registration is by far the bigger barrier than voter ID from what we know so far, but the 2 are sort of organizational barriers to voting. If you think about sort of a young person's journey, from an election being called to the ballot box. You know, they have to jump through hoops, and voter registration in Wales, for example, sifted out about 50% of young people because they didn't know they needed to be registered. They didn't manage to register because you need a national insurance number as well. Lots of formal communication, especially young people in unstable family environments struggle with that. So it's a factor of political inequality that determines who turns out to vote and who doesn't. Voter ID is likely going to be another hoop to jump through that's just going to sift out kind of a few more young people on their way to the ballot box. We know that young people are a little bit less likely to be aware of the need for voter ID, so the numbers are slightly higher among young people to struggle with that, but it's not massive from the first implementation of that we know. But voter registration in particular is a huge issue. Again, I've got a lot of experience from working in Wales. It's quite interesting that the two things are linked together, and so it's a bit of a no-brainer. That linking voter registration to the lowering of the voting age, however, is not going to solve all problems with sort of lowering the voting age and all the kinds of barriers that young people go through, not the least what we just talked about, that need to instill confidence in young people to make up their minds. But it is one of the big ones. You're absolutely right that lots of these issues hold in the same way for other minority groups. We know that renters, ethnic minorities, other kind of disadvantaged groups have very similar issues. Now, I don't want to suggest that young people are a disadvantaged minority, but there are sort of similar patterns to others. What is specific to young people are sort of the things that come with just being younger, because that's the only defining feature for young people, and that's having a little bit less experience or like political alignment, possibly being embedded in a family, which can be a positive effect because your family members take you through the hoops, or being a negative influence because there is lack of mobilization, and then that particular fact that young people are in secondary education when they are 16, 17. There is an opportunity, if anything, to engage with sort of the uniqueness of young people compared to other minority groups that also we struggle to mobilize to vote in elections. I'll leave it at that because I'm really keen to hear what Liz and Marcus have to say.
Great, thank you, Christina. Marcus, do you want to come in?
Yeah, much like Christina, I could probably talk to all those points, but I'll kind of focus in on voter ID. I won't kind of tranche through the arguments for or against it, because it's what we're living with. So I think it's much more practical to think about kind of the way in which young people will interact with that. And I think that something I found really interesting, it comes up every now and again, I see it online, talking about how an over 60s bus pass was valid ID for voting, but for example, a student card wasn't. In Scotland, we're lucky to have, I don't know if those days work, have something called issued to every young person in Scotland in their first year secondary school. But also it now contains our free bus pass, which we're able to access in Scotland. So every young person under the age of 22 can access bus travel for free. Scottish Youth Parliament policy, shameless plug. But it means that it's in the hands of every young person in Scotland, which is great, because I think if something like that was reflected across the UK, it's something that would go a long way to help with that. I think it's really important that when we're thinking about ID, we have parity of esteem across all age groups, and something that's valid ID for one age group should be valid across all. I think another thing which I think will go a really long way is the new government's policy of looking into digital IDs. I think for young people this will be really helpful. We've not got any consultation data on it yet from Scottish Youth Parliament, but call it a gut feeling. I think that young people would much rather have these things on their phone than in their pockets. But yeah, I think that that's probably what I would say in terms of that point. In terms of automatic voter registration, again, I've not really got any consultation data to hand about what young people think about that in Scotland. It's an interesting question. I think we should go out and ask and consult before we're looking into anything like that, and we probably will do. So yeah, I think that's probably what I would say in terms of those questions. Thank you for who chose them.
Thank you very much. And Liz?
Yeah, just to add to this a little bit. So I think there was an organisation that specialised in supporting young people with a simple citizen ID card during the last general election. So obviously targeting those who were eligible to vote. And I think it was called Citizen Card, but I can't be 100% sure on that. But I know this was something that was being funded and looked at very actively. But I think the point here is we've introduced voter ID relatively recently. I don't think we're all convinced by the need for it or the way it's currently operating, and it has caused some issues amongst some groups. And so we desperately need to get this right for whenever the next general elections happen, or indeed if there are any other elections where ID requirements start to shift. And simplifying it, certainly for all citizens, has got to be the way forward. I think specifically in relation to automatic voter registration, I'm not sure about that, but I think there is a role here for schools and colleges, certainly in terms of sharing information and supporting that process. I could envisage that when young people turn up, for example, on the first day of the new academic year, there could be some kind of enrolment process that's linked to their school or college enrolment process, and it could be seamlessly interwoven if it's properly organised and thought through. And I think some of the challenges around data protection and choice and those things need to be looked at very seriously. I think there are some good joined up conversations going on here in England, as well as what's going on in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The Electoral Commission is certainly playing a leading role in supporting some of this thinking, and indeed supporting citizenship and political education as well. And they see that as a very key part of their ongoing work. And I also think that Ofcom are increasingly playing a role in looking at the sort of disinformation side and linking to elections in particular. And I think there needs to be even further joining up across the different government departments to make sure this is done very thoroughly. There's no kind of excuse for it. And I suspect the Modernisation Committee in Parliament ought to be having a look at this as well, because as democracy modernises, digitises and changes, then clearly, the kind of education that we provide around elections, voting and citizenship more generally needs to be brought up to date and in line with how things are moving forward. In terms of sort of wider political reforms, there are all sorts of questions, aren't there, and debates about not just automatic voter ID or vote registration, but should you be required to vote? And an interesting, comparison with what goes on in other countries. Is the day of the week right? Are there different times, different days when we can hold elections? Currently, some schools have to close because they're polling stations. Is that right? There are lots of questions here, I think. And finally, I just wanted to kind of make a plug for a kind of programme of work that we ran in the last general election. And this is something I think is really important actually across the UK, is that general elections, and actually all elections, should be moments of kind of national celebration of democracy. And with that in mind, we ran what we called a parallel election. So a little bit different to what people might be familiar with in terms of mock elections. And I did see this was a question in the chat as well. A parallel election is an education process that mirrors the real election, where students get involved in every aspect of the election and the voting process, from evaluating manifesto pledges and sharing information with their peers, to setting up polling stations, counting the votes and reporting the results, and obviously being the election in hustings and acting as politicians. And it's something that we did in the general election for the very first time in a kind of thorough way, and it was incredibly successful. We managed to work with over 400 schools, and we had 30,000 students take part in a vote. Now, we couldn't break that down to a constituency level vote because there wasn't enough participation. But interestingly, the overall vote proportions mirrored very much the general population. And this was a way of engaging young people in the issues that were being discussed cast in the election, and we focused on a couple. We focused on education, housing and the environment specifically to make it a little bit more manageable for teachers and students. We learned about this process from colleagues in Scandinavian countries where they run similar activities, and they are seen as celebrations. And although it's not a real election, it's a genuine educational experience, and practicing those democratic skills and applying the knowledge and understanding and learning how it works. And we think this should be part and parcel of every good quality citizenship education programme going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. Lots of really important points there. Good. Unless anyone wants to pick up on anything further that anyone else said, I shall go back to Tom for a second round of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So these 3 questions are all about things that go on inside schools, and I think some of them pick up on things that have already been touched on already. So first, there's an anonymous attendee who asks if schools have a stronger pupil voice programme, so things like school councils, etc., where the pupils are part of the decision-making processes in schools, are there positive consequences for their attitudes towards voting or civic education in general? And then John Cartledge asks, are mock elections in schools a good way of teaching pre-16s about what's involved in voting and how to do it? And then Sean Morris asks whether, notes that citizenship education remains weak in many schools, and so he asks, how do we get it up the agenda, given that schools have so many other challenges to deliver?
Excellent, thank you. That builds on many of the themes we've been discussing a lot. Marcus, do you want to go first on, again, feel free to choose what you'd like to focus on within those 3 questions.
Thanks, Alan. I'll do my best to get over all of them because they're excellent questions. So I think kind of taking the kind of first point about mock elections and pupil councils, things like that, the short answer is yes, they are good resources for engaging young people in democracy. And I'd obviously plug the role of youth parliaments in that as well. But I think something is really important to think about this is about their setup, about their arrangement and what impact they can actually have on their immediate environment. I think something that we know from consulting with young people in Scotland about pupil councils is that more often than not, they can be seen as quite tokenistic bodies. I can reflect that from my own example at school in Angus. My school, when we were while I was there, changed our pupil council. So we went from being called a pupil council to a learning council, and we were kind of told the things that we to do. The reason for this was to stop talking about the school dinners being bad, the school toilet smelling, and the buses turning up late, and that we should focus more on what we're learning, which is good in theory. But when we actually start to think about it, if these are the topics that young people want to be speaking about, if these are the issues that young people have in their immediacy, then that's the kind of things that youth voice networks or pupil councils should be looking at. It shouldn't be for adults to dictate what young people are talking about in their space. And I think that speaks to probably the biggest challenge with things like that is about where the power lies, what dynamic is happening, who's setting the agenda. If it's youth-led, then all for it, let's do that. If young people are setting their own agenda, then these can have a great role. But I think that where we've got adults setting the agenda for young people's discussions, it can become a bit more of a grey area. So I think they need to be backed up with that legitimacy. I think the second part is schools that have to listen and act on what their pupil councils are telling them. It shouldn't just be for the head teacher to turn up and go, that was a nice chat. I think there should be kind of actions involved. It's something, I'm at university, I'm currently joining us from the University of Dundee. It's something which I'm involved in the Student Voice Network, and it's a bit of a challenge we have here too. So it goes throughout universities and kind of all education institutions, is what's the voice of students in the kind of overall picture. So I think it's about kind of actions as well as words. But the thing that really, for me, overarches this entire point is about young people's rights. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 12 of that, sets out that young people have a right to be heard. And in Scotland, we're very fortunate to have incorporated the UNCRC into Scots law, which is a long-standing Scottish Youth Parliament campaign. And for those who are not familiar with what that means, is much like what's happened with the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, we've taken the text of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and as far as possible, put that into law in Scotland. So schools, public bodies, NHS, they have to follow and respect that as much as possible. And it's something that's really, really important, because when we're teaching young people about their right to vote or their right to be heard, it actually sits in the roundabout all their rights overall. So the right to good education, the right to healthcare, really matters, because we're explaining to them not just about their participation in democracy, but their participation in society and what protections they have. And I think young people who are literate about their rights, I would argue, are also young people who are literate about their role in democracy, because they understand how their rights protect them. So it's kind of what I said in my opening remarks. These things are not detached, they're actually completely interlinked. And I think in Scotland there's going to be some interesting examples of that moving forward, now that we have an incorporation of the UNCRC, and seeing how that works about young people's right to vote.
Thank you. Christina, you want to come in? Oh,
just again, an aggressive agreeing with Marcus. I don't want to throw too much of a spanner in the works. Parallel elections are wonderful, and I think the closer they are in terms of time and realistic setup to an election, they can really inspire young people. But young people are much smarter than that on the whole. So what we know from evidence is that when there are trials with lowering of the voting age, for example, in Norway and Belgium, that are kind of not really having an impact because it's a trial, and you can appreciate that it's quite hard to experiment with something like the right to vote in sort of a scientific way. Turnout used to be quite low, and opponents of the lowering of the voting age often cite these examples as like, oh, this doesn't really work. If young people have the right to vote, they don't take it up. But the key difference is that these trials, similar to sort of a mock election, don't have an impact, and young people know that. So it's really more about what Marcus was saying, that we need to move to a society that appreciates young people for the citizens that they are, and takes their voice seriously, not just on certain delimited youth issues, but on the issues that young people care about. So really for that, it requires a change of the law more than anything, and sort of embedding capability building measures around that. But the change of the law is the most important thing here. It's not just about mock elections or trials.
And is it your sense that there's political will shifting in that direction?
We have seen across the world, particularly progressive governments coming into office and making that a pledge. You might call that opportunism, but I think there is an opportunity right now for particularly progressive governments to build that into their manifestos and be seen as sort of more progressive, youth-oriented. How that translates to this particular government, I think Liz has answered that quite aptly. They have a lot on their plate that might be more important. So it's probably a matter of timing rather than political will.
Interesting, thank you. Liz, you've said a fair bit about these questions already, but do you have any further points that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to support what others have said, really, you know, there is definitely a correlation between improving student voice and the role of young people as active participants in their school community, and the positive outcomes that we see through high quality, regular and mainstream citizenship education. And we've for a long time at ACT talked about the 3 C's model of citizenship. That's citizenship in the curriculum, the culture and the community of schools. There's little point teaching about democracy if you run your school as an authoritarian state that kind of ignores or disenfranchises the young people within that community. So going back to my earlier point, we need to see schools as microcosms of wider society, where they can test out ideas and practice democratic participation skills in real ways. And to pick up the point Christina was making about parallel elections, we ran parallel elections with all age groups, from the very young to the older students, and they worked brilliantly where they had the backing of the school leadership team, where the students really took the work forward themselves, and it really did mirror what was going on in the real election. It sparked that interest and engagement with what was going on in the country more widely, and that is only something that we really need to celebrate. And I also completely support what Marcus was saying about the importance of educating around rights and rights-based issues, because so many of the sort of public debates that we're having right now are really to do with those competing rights ideas, whether we're talking about free speech and where to draw the line around regulation, or you know, or the the specifics of voting rights and democratic rights, which is obviously our subject today.
Great, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so let's try to squeeze in one final round. Tom, if you've got one question that you think would really nicely wrap this up, then feel free to go with that. If not, a few quick questions.
Okay, maybe I've got two that I think are quick and one that's a bit larger, and people can choose which one they want to address perhaps. So Paul Smith asks whether panelists are aware of any other youth-led campaigns, particularly in England, and Paul asks because he's involved in a group, Politics in Action, who are supporting such a campaign in Northern Ireland. And he also asks whether people have a sense of the timeline for the introduction of legislation as it applies to England. And then an anonymous attendee asks the bigger question about whether this manifesto pledge could become a political hot potato, and if so, how the media will deal with it.
Excellent, thank you. And actually that question about timeline is one that I very much had in mind, because if we're thinking that we're going to have votes at 16 in an election potentially in spring 2028, that's only 3 years away, really. And if people need to be educated for some time in advance of that, then we've got to move pretty quickly. So that seems to me a really important point. 1 minute, each of you, on that final round of questions. Anything you want to pick up? Liz.
Yeah, you raise a really important issue about timing, and one of the crunch points here is the timing of the curriculum and assessment review in England. And I should just say there is a curriculum review that's affecting education in Scotland and also one in Northern Ireland. So 3 of the 4 parts of the UK are currently having another look at their education systems. And so we have to get this right, and we have to work urgently and quickly to do all the things we've been talking about, to raise the profile of citizenship education, to get more teachers into being trained citizenship specialists, and to support schools with seeing this as important as the other subjects and areas that they're teaching their young people about. And we can only really do that well is where the government come out very strongly and very clearly to support this kind of education. So we do need our politicians to start to speak up more loudly and more proudly about this kind of education.
Thank you so much. Marcus?
Thanks, Alan, and thanks to those who submitted those questions. I want to pick up on the point about, is it a political hot potato or could it become one? As someone who's a politics student, that's something that I'm kind of drawn to. Something I've actually thought about quite a lot in kind of preparing for this panel. I think we are in a situation where we're closer than ever before to having that right for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote across the UK. So I think that should be absolutely recognised, and that's a massive achievement. But I think something to be kind of aware of is about that as this legislation comes forward, as we expect it will, you know, we're in a increasingly sensationalizing media. We're in a situation where certain bad actors are now at play within our democracy, and people who are challenging the norms of our democracy and how it usually works. So I think that's all something to be aware of. I think the government does have a moral responsibility to make sure that they give this enough oxygen so that it gets through Parliament confidently, but not too much that it becomes a sensationalised issue. I remember reading, actually, I think it was in a modern studies class, an article by a journalist, I think it was possibly Katie Hopkins, but I'm not 100% sure, who was kind of saying, I don't support vote 16 because I think my teenager isn't smart enough to vote. It shouldn't be about whether, you know, we don't say that of any other age group. No other age group do we go and say, where's your IQ test that can prove that you can vote? There's only the way we set capacity to be able to vote is age. We are, you know, young people who are 16, 17 can leave school, work full-time jobs, pay taxes. They should be able to participate in our democracy like any other. And I think it comes back to that really important about that framing. The evidence as well, it's a net positive for democracy. There's so much to show that. So I think that we need to think about that. And I'm minded of that YouGov research that I mentioned earlier about the framing in terms of arguing about the right to vote rather than lowering the voting age. I think it links back to the fact that young people have this right, is what I've been saying throughout kind of the panel. Young people's rights are not detached from that, and we should remember that we're just allowing young people to access their own rights by giving them the right to vote.
Thank you so much. And Christina?
I think Marcus is really well onto something. We know that the public support is a framing issue to this question. And in Scotland, for example, public support shifted after the lowering of the voting age to most of the population now supporting this move. So in that sense, I would encourage any government that is looking into this to really treat it as an opportunity. Timeline for the next election to do it perfectly indeed is very tight. We've done some modelling. If you think about sort of backwards, you want to register young people maybe through schools and colleges. I know someone on the panel suggested that. Then you want to prepare schools for that. The legislation really has to come in by next summer, at the latest early 2027 for that to happen. But that doesn't mean that we can't do it at all. So I would encourage governments looking into this to look at this as an opportunity to really address multiple issues of young people's embeddedness in society as serious citizens, whether that is in sort of addressing all of these issues in a one hit with the lowering of the voting age as legislation coming in, or in steps after that. But I think as long as we think about sort of the multiple dimensions that we addressed today, education, the media, political parties, information, then there's a lot that can be shifted. And as Marcus said, it's a real big opportunity here.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you all so much. And much still to be done, clearly, but much optimism as well. Just before I thank you properly, let me just say a few things. So the recording of this seminar will appear on our YouTube channel and podcast feed in the coming days. Please do subscribe to those or look out for information on Twitter or on Blue Sky. If you're not already signed up to our events mailing list, you can do that in order to be the first to hear about our forthcoming events. Just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. And our next event is going to be on improving parliamentary scrutiny of legislation. The speakers will be our very own Parliament guru, Professor Meg Russell, former Commons Chief Clerk, Sir David Nutzler, and expert on private members' bills, Dr. Dan Gover. And I've just realised I forgot to write down in my notes when that is, but from memory it's the 24th of February, and Tom will shake or nod. It looks like he's nodding his head, so hopefully that is correct. So that's coming up in a month's time. But thank you to all of you for taking part and attending today's event, particularly to those of you who asked questions. And let me, on your behalf, thank our fantastic panel of speakers, Christina Huebner, Marcus Flucker, and Liz Moorse, as well as Tom Fleming for fielding the questions, and Ed Rowe, who has been in the background running things for us behind the scenes. So thank you to all of you. Good afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.